False teachers can even come from among God's people. And I'm speaking of the Lord's church, His body. I'm talking about God's people on earth today. False teachers can rise up from our own very midst. And how sad that is, but it's true. Look with me to Acts 20 at verse 29. We read there, as Paul was speaking to the elders from the church of Christ in ancient Ephesus, he said, "For I know this, that after my departing shall grievous wolves enter in among you, not sparing the flock." Now, there in verse 29, that wording seems to suggest that false teachers would come from the outside, that they would come in the church, as it were, and affect the church from the outside in. And so there are false teachers, certainly an abundance of false teachers outside of the Lord's church, men and women who have never obeyed the gospel, never been members of the body of Christ, and yet they're teaching falsehoods, and we know that to be true. But then the next verse, verse 30, reads as follows, "Also of your own selves shall men arise, speaking perverse things to draw away disciples after them." Now, the threat is not only from the outside with denominational teachers and with false teachers of various stripes, but there can be a threat arise from the inside. And as Paul was talking to these elders, it appears that he is forewarning that perhaps even out of their eldership, out of the rulers, the spiritual leaders themselves, that men would arise speaking perverse things in order to draw away disciples after them. That's scary. That's very sobering to think about. And so Paul said in verse 31, "Therefore watch, be diligent, and remember that by the space of 3 years I cease not to warn everyone night and day with tears." This broke Paul's heart. He was saddened to know that the time was coming when the brethren at Ephesus particularly would be impacted by wolves from without, but they would also be misled by men from within. And so characteristic number one of false teachers can be this: they can arise from our own number, yes, and even from among our own respected leaders, yes. And how sad that is. Now, characteristic number two, they can be very cunning, very subtle, and very deceptive in their approach. False teachers can be very deceptive in their approach, and really this is their cloak. This is their covering whereby they are able to espouse their error, spread their false doctrine without detection, at least for a while, until they're able to get those noxious seeds planted, and then the damage has already been done. We look together to 2 Corinthians 11, verse 13, where Paul wrote, "For such are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into the apostles of Christ." And no marvel, Paul says, don't let this blow your mind, so to speak. Don't find this incredible. He says there's no marvel. Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light. In other words, the master whom these false teachers serve, if he is a master of deception, if he uses guile and dishonesty and deception as his craft, then don't marvel when we see his servants, false teachers, doing the same. Verse 15, "Therefore it is no great thing if his ministers, if his servants also be transformed as the ministers of righteousness." And then Paul adds, "whose end shall be according to their works." In other words, God knows who they are. And God will recompense and God will requite them accordingly. But the danger is for us. The vigilance must be ours, recognizing that just because a man appears to be a good person and he appears to be teaching good things, we need to be careful. False teachers are notoriously cunning, crafty, deceptive, and thus we need to beware. And Jesus himself, he taught this same principle in Matthew 7, the Sermon on the Mount, when he said there in verse 15, beware of false prophets, which come to you in sheep's clothing. Outwardly, they appear to be sheep, just like you and just like I. They appear to be just like we are. But inwardly, they are ravening wolves. Again, if a false teacher hung a sign around his neck, flashing sign that said, false teacher, well, he would not meet with very much success. He first must be able to get his foot in the door, as we commonly say. He's got to be able to build a rapport with his hearers, and that necessitates a level of deception. It necessitates a level of concealment, not immediately revealing his intentions or his beliefs, not immediately. He's got to get a foot in the door and build a rapport with the people. And as he deceives the people, they become more and more susceptible to following what he says regardless.